A core business for a central bank is to supply the most liquid of assets, bank reserves. And we want to provide a framework to think about, as well as to quantify, the effects of supplying bank reserves on total investment and production in the economy. So the key here is to think hard about banks. What's special about them? So first thing, they lend to firms. This makes them important. Second, they are vulnerable to self-fulfilling pessimism because they borrow largely short-term and hold illiquid assets, such as mortgages. So we embed banks with these two characteristics in an otherwise standard macroeconomic model, as is typically used for business cycle analysis. We've seen a few examples of waves of pessimism about banks recently. A major one was the global financial crisis in the US between 2007 and 2009. After a fall in house prices, investors became pessimistic about banks. Because banks found it hard to fund themselves, they cut back on lending, and this caused a deep recession. So in line with this narrative, pessimism about banks in our model results from adverse shocks in the economy and exacerbates their macroeconomic costs. The key novelty of our model is its implication that supplying bank reserves can stem pessimism. So it can support investment and production. That's because more reserves lead to greater liquidity of banks' assets. And banks with more liquid assets are less vulnerable to pessimism. Quantitatively, we find that an increase in the supply of reserves that cuts the cost of liquidity by 10 basis points increases aggregate investment by about 1%. So finally, we go to the data to test whether increases in the supply of liquid assets make it easier for banks to access funding, as implied by the model. We focus on changes in the cost of liquidity driven by institutional peculiarities of the market for US Treasuries. So importantly for our purposes, these changes are basically random. With this, we find that an increase in the cost of liquidity causes an increase in banks' funding costs, just as predicted by the model. The implication is that in bad times, banks are desperate to get their hands on liquid assets because that is how they can stem pessimism. And if the central bank is willing to step in and provide those liquid assets in the form of bank reserves, that can go a long way in stabilizing the economy.